Shall we call this one to order, Mr. Chairman?
Yes, indeed.
How you guys doing down there in the house? Having a good day? Did you have a good breakfast?
You can't see that far down there, can you? From where you're at? From this end of the building to that end of the building?
Regards to
House Bill 47.
House Bill 47.
Mm-hmm.
This was the election equipment certification that was, I'm sorry, my microphone wasn't on, I apologize. Mr. Chairman, this is in regards to House Bill 47, which is the election equipment federal certification. And of course, a House bill, product of the interim work of the committee. And we took it up in the Senate after you guys had worked it, and we made some changes, of course. We removed 3 sections of the bill from your engrossed copy. That would have been, let's see, page 6, lines 10 through 15, and page 7, lines 6 through 12. And so the words that we took out, page 6, were upon written request by the Secretary of State, the vendor fails to submit the electronic voting system for re-examination by a voting system test laboratory certified by the United States Election Assistance Commission or National Institute of Standards and Technology. We removed that from the bill. And then on page 7, we removed Romanet 7 and Romanet 8. 7 reads, the electronic voting system vendor or its employees are found by the Secretary of State to be problematic in ensuring elections as critical infrastructure. And Romanet 8 is failure to comply with any other rule of the Secretary of State. And Senator Barlow was on the committee. Senator Salazar, I think, he's been following this bill very closely. So that's what we did. And gee, why do you guys find that so objectionable?
Why is that so offensive?
Yeah.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Co-Chairman, I think where we're at is just trying to understand the removal. What this is language that came in through a standing committee amendment on the House side.
Right.
When it was presented to us, it was presented as basically this bill is a codification of the Secretary of State's rules with respect to the election equipment federal certification. And what was presented to us was additional rules that exist in this area, but are not inside the bill. And so our understanding was the language that you took out that we put in is simply in the Secretary of State's rules currently. And we were told that we were codifying with this amendment all of the rules with respect to this subject matter. And I know the Secretary of State's office is here. My hope is just to understand that a little more. If I think it cuts both ways. If this is all the rule that we're leaving out, then I guess I'd want to understand why we want to leave it out of statute. If it is in rule, and if it's not in rules, then I think we can talk about the subject matter itself. If it's not in rule and we leave it out of the statute, my understanding is then the Secretary of State still does this. They just do it by rule instead of by statute.
Yeah, I think, Mr. Chairman, our concern was about election integrity and about we're very worried about a unilateral action that might call into question an election that's it's either happening or imminently going to happen. And this was certainly not part of the interim work. And so we were kind of surprised to see that kind of coming down to where one person could decide the fate of a Wyoming election. And that just seemed a little scary to us, to be really honest.
and again, we'll have to hear from the Secretary of State, but I think whether whether we pass your version of the bill or not, the Secretary of State can still do that. That's my understanding.
I guess, Mr. Chairman, I guess the rules would be tested, probably in court at that point, and whether they exceeded the statutory authority or not. Certainly what we embark on today and how this bill passes has a bearing on that, I think.
What was the language on, I'm trying to track this in, on page 7, what was deleted?
Page 7.
I have copies if you want to look at the deleted.
Of what's deleted?
From your engrossed bill,
Lines 10 through 15.
10 through 15?
page 7, no, it's lines 6 through 12. So it's Romanets 7 and 8. And on page 6, Mr. Chairman, it's lines 10 through 15, which is Romanet 3.
Okay.
And then we had another inconsequential amendment that was really a typo.
Yeah, on page 7.
Yeah,
That's the,
County A went to A County.
now that part we definitely agree on.
Okay,
That one made a lot of sense to us.
let's vote on that.
We'll meet the
I don't mean to do all the talking for the committee. Representative Barlow, Senator Barlow, Senator Salazar. We had heard from folks in the industry, in our county clerks and others. They're the ones in the field, and we paid a lot of attention to what they had to say. I don't know if you want to take testimony or anything.
Mr. Chairman, I guess, I believe that page 6, line 10, and page 7, line 6, those two that were taken out on the Senate side, I think, my feeling is that they should go back in. And with regard to page 8, failure to comply, I can live with keeping that out, but the first two, page 6, line 10, numeral 3, and then page 7, line 6, numeral 7, I think those are things that I would support. I have trust in the Secretary of State's office. They're monitoring the entire state, not just a particular county. I don't have a problem with putting that responsibility. And as a matter of fact, from what I understand from Representative Olson, they have that, they've had that power. It's in statute. So to take it out, I just have a problem with that.
So, Mr. Chairman, I don't believe it's in statute. It might be in
in
rules, and I
rules.
don't know when those rules were put in.
I don't know.
So, Mr.
Maybe
Chairman,
COVID rules.
Mr. Chairman or
think they
Chairman, I'm going to comment more broadly. The bill title, as it was introduced from the Corporations Committee, was very specific, I believe, to codification of the rules for certification. And the additions that were made in the House Standing Committee, I would argue, go beyond rules for certification. They ask for additional information, which I'm not saying is bad information, but is not specific to the certification, whereas the initial items are in the bill. So when the Senate got it and said, okay, well, maybe this stuff, some of this we can abide by, but some of it, would we want to codify this type of language? Now, having actually spent 6 years in the executive branch as a board member on a board, I am very cautious I am very concerned when the legislature starts codifying a bunch of stuff, because that takes away the ability of an elected official in this case, or a executive branch agency to actually deal within the realm. I mean, it's gone. That is gone. The legislature says this is the way it is, we're done. And so that's where I was in this. I felt like the House Standing Committee went too far to begin with. And then, so how do you pare that back? These were two items that we heard public testimony on, and those were a couple that I felt comfortable paring back on. Just what's the definition of problematic? I mean, that's one of the things that the Senate Standing Committee took out was problematic. What is that? Decertification of equipment that does not belong to the person who is requesting the decertification, or not, or the, reexamination, excuse me. So I think it's more a case about, did this go outside the bill title with the original amendment from the House? I think we can make that argument potentially. Second, are these, at least from the Senate's standing committees, or did these go even further and maybe lack some clarity about what they were? Now, to my good colleague, Senator Salazar's point is maybe these go back in, but if they go back in for me, they have to be some sideboards on them, for me personally. And I think that's where the Senate was. Those two were brought as a second reading amendment in the Senate and were rejected by the body. So we took it out as a standing committee. Those two, and I think Senator Salazar would agree, two of them were brought back in as I think it was a second reading amendment, and they were defeated by the body. So we've got two times the Senate has taken a position on that. Once with a standing committee amendment, and second with a subsequent amendment to reinsert them. One was adopted, one was failed. That's two. In my view, that's a fairly strong position from the Senate as far as where we are. House can say we did the same thing. We adopted them, standing committee amendment, and we passed the bill. Say the same thing. So we either work within the bounds, which the bounds are these three things, these three items. We either work within the bounds of that, or we go to a freer committee and we decide, no, we want to go further back. If I go further back, Mr. Chairman, it's going back to the bill as introduced. Because I think that is the cleanest place for certification of the voting systems. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chairmans.
Other members, I haven't heard much from the House side. Representative Chadwick, do you want to hear from? Okay. All right. Mr. Secretary?
Chairman, for the record, is it okay if I go?
What's that?
Can I start?
Yeah, go,
Thanks, Mr.
please.
Chairman. Always try to make it clear that you're in control.
Oh,
Thank you. For the record, I'm Chuck Ray, the Wyoming Secretary of State, and to my left is Joe Rubino, our Chief Policy Director, and also our General Counsel. And I appreciate you, the conference committee's work and everybody's work on this. House Bill 47 is supposed to codify the existing practice for certification of election voting systems. Those rules are found in Chapter 12 relating to the certification of voting equipment and became effective in May of 2020. However, as originally drafted, House Bill 47 only selectively codified these rules, having stripped many important metrics regarding the certification of voting equipment in Wyoming, which had been in place for several years. Accordingly, our office worked with the House Corporations Committee on providing an amendment which conformed House Bill 47 to the existing language found in Chapter 12 of the Secretary of State's rules and regulations pertaining to certification of voting equipment. So that was actually a codification then of the grounds for denial or withdrawal of certification. Mr. Rubino, could you hand out that rule just so we can jog everybody's memory? I think all but two were on the standing committee side. So as you can see there on page 12-2 and 12-3, section 3, that was the grounds for certification. And there were 8 metrics there. And the original bill only had 2 of them in the bill. And I think in terms of election integrity, that was problematic. And so we came and said, look, let's put in what's an existing rule into the statute. And that was passed by the House Standing Committee. Then on the Senate side, several grounds for denial or withdrawal of certification were subsequently taken out of a newfound concern regarding the possibility of abuse of these requirements for certifications. So I want to go through each of these. I mean, the first is, and you know, you turn to 12-3 and look at the way this is worded. It's not the Secretary of State's office that's doing the examination. It's upon written request, the vendor, by the Secretary of State, the vendor fails to submit the equipment for re-examination by an EAC certified voting system test lab. So it's not, if people are concerned about me or any future Secretary of State, it's not me doing that. It's being re-examined by the EAC, and what the original line from the clerks was as to why we're doing this is to codify EAC certification of our machines, which is very clear in our rules. And I can tell you, I would be shocked if any SOS were to move away from EAC certification. That is a gold standard, or a basic standard, I would say. And why then would we not allow for re-examination by the EAC, which was supposed to be the original intent of the bill? And then the other one is the equipment vendor or its employees are found to be problematic in ensuring elections as critical infrastructure. And you know, that came about here in the last few years due to cybersecurity concerns and in terms of what is critical infrastructure. But you know, I guess I would ask the committee, I mean, we have the Beitman Amendment from the Senate side, which we're happy to concede the blanket authority on, you know, that was in the other provision, as Senator Salazar said. I mean, honestly, we gave two options to the Joint Corporations Committee on the House side. We said, let's just amend in our entire rule or just have a blanket authority if you don't want it to go too long. And they decided to do both. We asked for one or the other. And they went with both. So, I mean, that's fine, but I just think it's important from an election integrity perspective to have the security in there. I guess overall, I mean, one way we could approach this, and I was thinking more about Senator Barlow's comments, is, you know, I think he has a point. The bill title was about certification. So, you know, these other items which you're continuing to look at, maybe we can deal with that separately, if that's the clear understanding of the bodies. And I do acknowledge that point. But overall, from an election integrity perspective, I'm very concerned that we're taking out of, if there's an understanding we're taking out of EAC re-examination of these machines, I mean, that's really troubling. And I just am really concerned why we wouldn't have that in our standards. But I mean, if it's initial certification, I guess you could say then that the re-examination is a separate issue. So that's my comments on the bill.
Representative Washut?
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, not having been on the committee when this bill was heard, can you give me a quick summary of pros and cons of codifying these rules as opposed to just keeping them in your own rules?
Mr. Secretary?
You know, Mr. Chairman, I've asked myself that from the beginning of this, once I saw what was going on here. Originally, I thought, you know, nothing's happening here. We're just codifying the EAC. And then I saw that 2 of the 8 standards were copied and pasted into this bill, and the other 6 weren't there. And then one of them was actually revised. And I personally don't think the bill overall is necessary. I can tell you, I have no interest in removing EAC certification from the machine for the machines. Zero interest in removing that. I think that is an important thing to have in there, but it's not the only thing. And that's the point of Secretary Buchanan's rules. I didn't write this rule, Secretary Buchanan. And I don't want to get into people's heads about what's going on in their heads, but the legislative history on this has not necessarily tracked with what I thought, or what I was told the intent was, in my opinion. And so I'm just, it's been a weird last 3 weeks on this bill. You know, based on Senator Barlow's statement, you know, if we just want to have this bill deal with certification and adopt 6 of the 8, and then re-examination's a separate issue. But here's the thing, I mean, something can come up along the way. It's a continuing iterative process on these machines, okay? Just because it's initially certified doesn't mean the process is over. And what I was a little concerned about is the initial drafting of the bill seemed to preclude that. I guess we could say that's a separate process. But I'm not totally understanding, you know, since then, I think the clerks on the rule, I mean, they'll probably get up here and talk a little more on the background. I don't think they liked the initial rule, okay? And so then this became a vehicle to sort of codify portions of the rule. And I guess I would just say is, you know, we've got to be going deeper here. I mean, what is the actual process we're going to have? And I don't know. I mean, it's been an interesting last 4 weeks. I don't think the bill's very necessary, personally.
Follow up? So, Mr. Secretary, if the bill's not necessary, then passing the bill and with the Senate's version ends with a codification of certain rules, but your rules still exist. And if the bill's not necessary, I'm assuming you believe that because of you have your rules. So
Yeah.
are you in any worse off position if we just adopt the Senate side and you operate under what's left with your rules?
Mr. Chairman, in light of how the bill draft title is written, I think I'm okay with that. Because it is narrowly oriented towards that specific item.
Mr. Secretary, talk to me about the rules came into existence, the certification of voting equipment rules during the pandemic. So they were a product of legislation that gave you rulemaking, not gave you, but gave your office rulemaking authority. Is there any reason to believe that your rules aren't current right now?
Oh, Mr. Chairman, they're current. I mean, in light of the bill, I think we'll have to, you know, fix them a little bit. But I mean, it's literally a copy and paste the way the engrossed version was sent over, absent a couple changes that was in the original bill, which I thought were interesting within one of the provisions. But you know, I do think it's a little bit superfluous. I don't want to concede that. I still would like it the way the House version is, but I think this is kind of a little bit of a shell. You know, I mean, the re-examination is a separate topic. I think that argument I think has some grounds. So I mean, this bill would basically then be silent on re-examination. And that was Senator Barlow's point. And
Representative Washit?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So just so I'm clear here, if part of your rules are codified and part are not, it's your understanding that the rules that are not codified would still remain in effect and operational for your office. Is that your testimony?
Mr. Secretary?
Mr. Chairman, you know, we'd go through that process with the Attorney General and my general counsel. I mean, I think that the ones that aren't in conflict could be, but I think what we do is we just issue a new rule. eliminating the portions that are already in statute. And I mean, the rule has other things in there that didn't have to do with certification. It has to do with the purchase of election equipment, maintaining certification. So, you know, if this bill is just limited to certification, then, okay. I mean, there's other stuff in the rule.
Senator Salazar?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So, Mr. Secretary, I was going to fight for the Beitman Amendment here today.
I would ask you to, yeah. Mr. Chairman,
Okay.
I would ask.
I misunderstood. I thought
Yeah.
you had said that.
I think we should adopt it that way. I really do. But if we don't, I still interpret the bill as not touching reexamination. You know, that's what I'm saying.
So your option A, your preference of option A is the Beitman Amendment, which I don't even know exactly what that is. Somebody's going to have to.
The Beitman Amendment is a beautiful compromise, Mr. Chairman.
A beautiful compromise, huh?
It's my opinion. Mr. Chairman, it removes the blanket authority and then places back the critical infrastructure language and the submission to the EAC.
Anybody in the audience do this?
You know, and I want to respond a little bit. I think the clerks are going to talk about the timing on this. They're concerned that, you know, a reexamination could conflict with an election or delay an election. I mean, this is why we have elected officials to have judgment on that. I mean, if there's a material concern, then we'll have to deal with it on the ground. If, you know, there's some bombshell that happens in the country, I mean, but I think we'll be doing that with other states because ES&S is in, I think, over 20 states now. But to say that we're not going to have a reexamination of equipment just because we're concerned that the election might not happen, if there's some sort of material change across our country, you have no procedure for that, that I think is very problematic. And I don't, pardon the pun, but I think that is a real problem. And so to say there's going to be no reexamination process within an election period in any circumstance, I think is you know, a problematic position.
Mr. Chairman, just to be clear, the Senate rejected this, and I think my members of the Corporations Committee would wholeheartedly reject this. These are the two most problematic things. Mr. Chairman, I'm hoping we could maybe hear from others about this, the clerks and things, and it also, I wonder if we should have a discussion of why we would, you know, the rulemaking process is not the same as our process. And there, we have separation of powers for a reason. And so when we go in and we codify the rules of an agency developed through their process, you know, it's a bit concerning. This came about in the interim because our county clerks expressed concerns about election equipment certification. And we wanted to make sure we could make sure the equipment would be federally certified. So that was the bottom line motivation. And so the fact that we are in a box where we have to adopt the rules of an agency that went through a completely different process is problematic to me, and a separation of powers kind of thing. I think we certainly have the ability to decide policy, and I think we did.
Okay, let's hear from the clerks. Ms. Langford. Welcome.
It's really weird to watch yourself be like a minute behind or something.
Yeah, it's strange.
Really
It's delayed.
unsettling.
Good afternoon, committee. I am Mary Langford, and I have the honor of representing the county clerks of the state of Wyoming. And with me today, I have Malcolm Irvin, who is the Platte County Clerk, as well as the president of the Clerks Association. And I'm going to hand off to him.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would really like to start by just clarifying something. The Secretary said that, that this bill became a vehicle by which the county clerks could, and I'm going to paraphrase here, that it was a vehicle by which we could pick and choose which rules we did and did not like. And that's just not true. Mr. Chairman, we began in the interim early spring and into the summer, working with the previous Secretary of State's office and talking about the certification and the codification of that provision of rule. But in no way was it a picking and choosing. I want to be very clear about that. In Senate corporations, after we had some time to digest and really discuss and consider, we really did have some concerns about the sections that were omitted on pages 6 and 7. And our concern, and Secretary Gray called it a newfound concern, which is true, but it should not have been. Mr. Chairman, I want to be very clear that and own up to we were complicit in the 2020 rule cycle. Had we been less complicit, we would have really objected to those sections even under Secretary Buchanan. It does not matter who occupies the office. Our position is that it's such broad authority that an individual or a single office could really impact county-owned equipment. And that's perhaps the most important part of this discussion that has not been brought up yet. We are talking about equipment that is owned by the county. And Mr. Chairman, those two sections offer at no point for the county who actually owns the equipment to have any say in their equipment. And to Secretary Gray's point about recertification, or if there's a concern, there should be some provisions in this, whether it's rule or whether it's statute, that really address why it's important that if there's an error, we have recourse. And the most important part of this bill is that it challenges this equipment to tabulate accurately. And Mr. Chairman, I would argue that that's really the primary concern. Does the equipment work? And by work, I mean tabulate votes accurately. And so, Mr. Chairman, this bill, as it came out of the Senate Corporations Committee, provided just that. If it did not count accurately, there would be recourse. There would be an ability to decertify it. And Mr. Chairman, that would be based off actual evidence of an error because it did not tabulate correctly. So a county canvassing board or the state canvassing board would then acknowledge that mistake and that error, and the equipment would no longer maintain its certification. And so, Mr. Chairman, those two sections on pages 6 and 7, the first on page 6, lines 10 through 15, where it says, upon written request by the Secretary of State, the vendor fails to submit. And again, the EAC is doing the recertification, which is great. Our concern is that it doesn't say after this point or because of this, the Secretary of State would submit this equipment to be recertified or reexamined. Where it's going to be reexamined, that's great. That's exactly the place it should be going, to the EAC for reexamination. But Mr. Chairman, the concern is that there is no time frame, there's no reason. It just allows that authority in one entity, regardless of who holds the office at the time. Our position is that it's county-owned equipment, and for that equipment to be subject to the decision of an office is a concern. And Senator Salazar's point that the Secretary of State has to look out for the entire state and not just a single county is well taken and well stated. But Mr. Chairman, at the county level, we are the closest to the equipment, closest to the actual administration of the election. And so that's where the concern should emanate, realistically, is because administering the equipment, working the equipment, we should be the ones that convey that concern that, hey, our equipment is not working. And then from that point, it's a team effort. Mr. Chairman, it's always been a team effort, and it will continue to be, but that's what we want to make sure this bill says. On page 7, lines 6 through 9, to pretty much everybody's point, the word problematic is so open-ended. At what point does an employee or a vendor become problematic? And again, Mr. Chairman, understanding the intent is cybersecurity related, and and working through the 2020 cycle with the pandemic and the state of Wyoming purchasing equipment for counties and then reverting that control to the counties, we were just complicit in the rulemaking process. And so I apologize for that. I really wish we had the ability to go back in time so we did not have to have this conversation here, that we could have had this at a different time and worked through these concerns. And so, Mr. Chairman, on behalf of the clerks, I apologize that we weren't more in tune to that rulemaking process, but we've learned our lesson, that I can guarantee you. So, Mr. Chairman, that's our concerns with pages 6 and 7, and we would be happy to answer any questions you may have.
Mr. Chairman. Mr. Irvin, how about the lines 11 and 12 on page 7? You didn't mention them specifically, but
And
to me, that's very broad, and I don't know what all those could pertain to.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. I honestly failed to mention those because I felt it was agreed upon that 11 and 12
Okay.
were not necessary. And we would agree with that. We hold the same position as Secretary Gray, that rulemaking authority still exists for the office. And so really adding it, one, isn't entirely necessary, but two, it would be awfully broad, Mr. Chairman. So we would agree with what's been said already.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I'm trying to understand if the argument that if we pass the Senate version, that doesn't change anything because it's still in the rules, or the rules still are out there and they could still be followed. I'm not sure, Mr. Chairman, and I lean on you a little bit. I totally agree with that. It seems like when the rules would be implemented down the road, they could be challenged, in court to say they're not in the law, that they're beyond the law. So maybe you could help me with that. But it seems like if we pass the Senate version, we do at least have the legislature on the same page.
Mr. Chairman, I think there's an argument to be made in that respect. If the bill specifically said, and all other rules are hereby repealed, I think that would make legislative intent very obvious.
Yeah.
If I were the court, I would be looking for that language. Otherwise, I would say, well, the intent was to codify some and leave some in rules, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you didn't want them. Yeah. I think an argument can be made both ways. But until or unless it's challenged, they would remain in effect.
Mr. Chairman, so if I could, they would certainly remain in effect to the extent that they're not in conflict. And I think when we look at the entirety of the rules that the House amendment brought in, I mean, we have many more rules that were not being brought in. We have withdrawal, decertification, maintaining certification, withdrawal. I mean, there's other things in the current rules in effect right now that are not being brought into this bill. And I think that goes to my inquiry about the codifying the certification portion. There's other things in this rules besides certification. There's maintaining it, there's revoking it, there's withdrawing it, there's et cetera, et cetera. Probably we can't actually, unless we want to work between the two positions of the two bodies, and I would say that the rulemaking authority exists already, or we wouldn't have these rules before us to begin with. Mm-hmm. So that particular part of the bill has just been relevant to certification. There's much broader rulemaking authority under 22-121. It's already there. Currently has it. That is, if we want to find a position between the House and the Senate position, we only have those two sections to work between, either with them, without them, or something in between. They are massaged a little bit in some way. So, I mean, I'm just pointing out, I think the rules as they are in effect. The bill will only change anything that would be in conflict. Everything else stands the same, unless, to the House Chairman's point of view, unless we say for all other items, there will be a rulemaking process. And we're not doing that, at least not in the bill as presented. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Salazar, you want to say something?
Yeah, I guess my I didn't want these out of the Senate side to begin with. So I guess I'm sympathetic to the House. I mean, this really comes down to voter integrity. And that was a really big issue in my neck of the woods. And quite frankly, this is what the Secretary of State's office is all about to begin with. And I am in no way thinking less of our clerks. They have to do their job, and they're doing a good job. But the Secretary of State's job looks at the entire state, the election process. And he's testified before us that this is what he needs to bring about that election integrity, which we all know was a very important issue last year. And so all I wish to do is to give him the full tools that he needs to carry out his job, and at the same time, satisfy the vast majority of my constituents who agreed with that opinion. So I believe that what we are calling the Beitman Amendment is something that needs to stay in. And I'm willing, my good friend, I'm willing to massage and talk about how we could come to an agreement and still have this framework. But no, I think this amendment's really important.
And see, I'm kind of waffling a little bit here because I've learned a lot more. Coming into this, I believed that what this bill was a codification of all of the rules dealing with certification of voting equipment. In other words, this entire 12.2 through 12.5, I believe that's what we were doing. And the only reason we were including the language that you've taken out is because it was the remainder of what was in the rule that wasn't in the statute. I'm seeing that's not the case. So I think that argument that it's just simply our rules being codified, and if we're going to codify some, let's codify all. It's no longer there, so I'm no longer on that. Also, the clerks, this is new information for us because on the House side, we didn't receive this testimony from you when we were adopting this rule. And I'm not picking sides. I don't think we're picking sides between the Secretary of State's office and the clerks. We're just weighing all the information. And that certainly changes my perspective of the amendment now as well. I'd like to hear from the other House members on how you're feeling, but I'm not necessarily opposed to, I'm very much open right now to the Senate's amendment. In other words, that's how I feel. Representative Chadwick.
Thank you, Mr. Co-Chairman. I would agree. After hearing from our county clerks, I put a lot of weight in what they say. And I'm glad they got the testimony that we did not. And it certainly changes my perspective. Thank you.
Representative Washit.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm still focused on this term problematic on line 8, page 7. And I really think that's a term that's so generic that really deserves definition. And I think that's beyond us. We can leave it in or take it out. It's basically the options before us today. But I wouldn't mind leaving that language in if we could fix the definition issue on problematic. But as is, I guess I'm of the opinion that, the bill doesn't do what I thought it was supposed to do. And I'm not convinced that we need to pass it.
Yeah, that's another question. I mean, do we even need this bill? Because that's in part what I heard from Senator Barlow is that we, and from you, Chairman Case, do we even need the bill?
Well, Mr. Chairman, that's something I've been thinking about. I think we brought this in the interim because the clerks asked for it. And they felt that they needed a framework for election equipment federal certification. To be honest, I'm not as convinced that we need this. And Senator Barlow's worked pretty hard to try to convince me that we need the bill to be proactive against the rules that are already out there, but I'm not 100% convinced of that. And I'm trying to get my hand around that. So I'd love to hear from the clerks more. Do we really need this bill?
Yeah, we asked the Secretary of State the same question. It's not his first preference, but at the end of the day, he did say he didn't think maybe the bill's not necessary. Clerks?
Mr. Chairman, it's an excellent question. And I, again, want to be clear that it wasn't just us that brought it in the interim. It was working alongside the Secretary of State's office, because it really opened that greater question of, to what standard should our equipment be held in order or prior to us using it? And that standard was federal certification. And Mr. Chairman, it really became a greater policy discussion, and for us, an important administrative discussion. And where Chairman Olson said, you're not picking sides, I do think us and the Secretary of State are in agreement. We want federal certification, and that's where this emanated. That the amendments that came took it beyond that original scope and outside of what we talked about in the interim. However, I don't think there's two sides. I think there's an agreement that we want federal certification of equipment. And that's what this bill was designed to do, was to codify that requirement. That the equipment we use, and prior to our use, it must be federally certified. And really, that's just because of staffing concerns. We don't have the staff or the expertise in order to have a testing laboratory. And so, Mr. Chairman, it just put this in the hands of people who understood those requirements and had the staff to implement those requirements better than us. And so, Mr. Chairman, we think it is necessary, and we think that the two sections the section on page 6 and the section on page 7 could certainly come back into the bill. We're looking for something that allows for that teamwork. And so, Mr. Chairman, again, I don't think there's two sides. I think it's the same, and we're in agreement. We just want federal certification of equipment.
I'm wondering if we could take a break for a couple days, Mr. Chairman, mull this over.
I don't think there's any harm in that.
We got lots of time.
We got 8.5 days left in the session. We don't have to solve all the world's problems today.
We could come back on Thursday at the same time, 12:30. I won't double schedule and see if we got anywhere.
Okay. Senator Barlow?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I think in the meantime, and I know there's an interest expressed to bring some of this language back in. What I'm going to try to find is a mid-place between the reexamination for what purposes. The purpose for the reexamination, which I think is already contained in the bill, fails to count accurately. There's a concern by the clerks. There's updates were not provided. So I think there's actually a way to do that. The problematic language, I think we can actually duplicate that language, maybe, or not duplicate the problematic, duplicate why we would be concerned. Inaccuracy, failed to submit things when they should have, et cetera. I think there's a way to do that. I would say, though, if we're going to go much further with this, that does change the role of the current rules, or we'd have to go to a free committee, potentially, to say, please take a look at the rest of the rule that was not brought into the codification. Because there's things in these rules, current rules, now we've got to have a rulemaking process to make this all fit together. Potentially. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Salazar.
Well, I'd like to hear from the Secretary on his thoughts on this.
Mr. Secretary?
I appreciate that, Mr. Chairman. I would like to weigh in one more time on whether this bill is necessary. I was asked at the end, and there are a lot of different things floating, and I just want to be clear, I don't think it is. I mean, the problem is that, this EAC certification is very clear, and I don't think I'd be shocked if anybody were to ever take that away. And what I heard originally was the intent of this bill was to put in statute EAC certification. And that's why initially I was thinking, that's a no-brainer. But then you see that there's all these other issues that interact with the certification of election equipment. And, you put in statute one thing, why isn't the other thing there? I think it's better for us to have an interaction with the clerks on the certification of these machines. And by the way, we just purchased new machines that'll probably be around for decades. So right now, the only question is reexamination, and which is totally separate from the bill title. I mean, certification, the original certification is a totally different topic that I don't think is going to happen again for decades. So, the way this was pitched to me and all of the initial onboarding when in the transition meetings we had is this is just certifying EAC certification. It's just certifying EAC certification. Well, I'm fine with that. But how about all these other issues that are currently part of the practice of not only this Secretary of State's office, but Secretary of State's office around the nation? And how does this interact with that? I just don't think it's necessary because I think EAC certification is a no-brainer. And you look a little deeper at the language, how it changed the rule. This did something different than initial EAC certification. It actually changed the complaint process. I could dig deeper into that if you want. So I think the way this was originally, the intent of it is different from how it turned out on paper. So, thank you.
Mr. Chairman?
Yes.
Well, how about if we go digest all this stuff, and we obviously can't come back with a report that exceeds the bounds of the two houses. So at our next meeting, we wouldn't be able to do that. But it doesn't mean that we couldn't explore in different directions to try to, see if we decide that this is necessary or that it can be improved. And if we decide it can be improved outside the bounds of this committee, we can go back and ask for reappointment as a free committee. But I think it'd behoove us to spend a couple days thinking about it now that you kind of understand it and you guys kind of get where we're at. I've learned some new things today and I appreciate hearing from everybody. So I'd like to suggest we just meet again on Thursday at 12:30.
Can we do 1 o'clock?
1 o'clock's
I have
fine.
at 12:30.
No problem.
Okay,
Absolutely.
let's do it.
It's a House bill, so it'll be in this room.
Do you
Yeah.
take care of that for us, Lily? Or
It's-
1 o'clock on Thursday in this room? Okay,
Unless it's already booked. Yeah.
thank you.
Thank you very much.
All right, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
We'll recess until Thursday at 1.
Let's spend some time thinking about this. Thank you.
Okay. Yep, thanks. This was helpful.
We're going to move it.
I think we need that.
Yeah. I know.
Think so?
Still think outside.
Now,
Do you understand a little bit where we were coming from?
now I do, yes, big time.
But you also understand the quicker.
Yeah, I don't know, I think my committee was there, honestly, to go if you want your amendments.
You too. So, you're the one that expressed some concern about that because the rules still hang on. The statute.
I apologize.
Unless you put something in that says the rest of the rules.
Yeah, that's just it. We have to be a free community. You could just come back and you guys would have to rescind for non-concurrence. And you can do that. You can do that without us.
We could do that now. Right. Just go.
You just talk to your committees. You don't need us.
I kind of feel like we're forced to.
We're gonna move it.
And I think we have the votes.
We're on the floor. In fact, this whole setup for Thursday.
That now.
Okay. She could be a friend. Because we're crazy. That's crazy.
Sorry, you think I threw